things are valued. Okay, I was just told the recording is in progress. Okay,
Yes.
right, so where does grammar fit in? This is the whole point, because first we look at the mind, then we look at language, and then where is grammar? And then I want to go back to a very old hypothesis, way back to the late 70s, early 80s, called the affective filter hypothesis, which was an interesting hypothesis, quite challenging, but it was formulated in those days in very general terms. And I'm going to see how we can improve it using the modular cognition framework, if it needs improving or if it's worth improving. And finally, of course, I'll have a short conclusion. Okay, take the popular belief. Now, I think as far as all kinds of learning is concerned, if your learning is for you a high value goal, that's to say, for you positive affect is involved, then it will stimulate you to perform better and learn faster. That's we generally think that as language teachers, for example. By contrast, if it's a low value for me, if you're not interested in it, you don't like it, it will work in the opposite direction. There will be delayed learning and possibly you will stop learning early. So high value or positive affect is very often referred to as motivation, so motivated, and negative affect is usually referred to as unmotivated or demotivated or having a negative attitude. All of these will be familiar to you. And as regards second and foreign language, a learner with a high motivation will acquire the language quickly, and by extension, with low motivation will acquire the language slowly and stop early. So nothing too controversial about that, since it is a popular belief and it seems to have some truth to it. Now, teachers having this belief may just accept, or faced with this proposal, may simply say, well, of course, and they may accept this generally held belief and plan their teaching accordingly. And this would be the practitioner response. They may not be especially interested in the whys and wherefores, but they are interested in how to make their teaching more effective. On the other hand, researchers need to know much more. They need to know if it's true, and if it's true, when and how and why. So that would be the scientific response. Okay, now here's my very rapid introduction to the modular cognition framework. So what is it? It's a theoretical framework. It's not a theory. It's not a theory. And it draws on a range of contemporary research from different areas of cognitive science, not just linguistics, not just psychology, but different areas. And it sort of integrates them to give a basic model of how contemporary thinking sees the human mind operating. And it needs to be elaborated, not by me or John Truscott, but by the people who are expert in all these different areas of the mind. We have actually elaborated it in an area that we feel a little more competent in, and that is in language. Okay, but as to the other areas, that's another matter. Well, he's a psychologist, so we've implemented in psychology as well. So anyway, how does the mind work according to this general perspective? Well, it's a network, but what is a network of? It's a network of cognitive, if you like, mental systems, right? These mental systems are there, but they are physically manifested in the brain, in neural tissue, but very differently. So if you have a set of 5 systems, they're much more neatly explained at the level of cognitive systems. But once you get into how they're manifested in the brain, you'll find these systems cover a lot of pathways and different locations in the brain. So for the neuroscientists, in this respect, it's a much more difficult problem. It's hard enough for us, but it's a more difficult problem for the neuroscientists. However, the neuroscientists may not have a very good picture of the mind as a whole, and that's where frameworks like this will come into use. So, okay, going back to each system has a unique function, right? It has so your visual system deals only with vision. It handles visions according to visual principles. It has no ability to handle any other system. And it has its own unique principles, as I say, and it's human vision we're talking about in this case, not animal vision. So a dog vision will have different principles than a human will. Okay. If we can simplify it down to its most basic form, each of these systems do have something in common. Okay, they're all unique in one sense, but they do have something in common, a basic architecture, a basic construction, right? And they each have a processor and a store, right? And a store you can think of, if you like, as a memory store. And these contain representations of various types, visual representations, syntactic representations. There they are. The processor organizes these according to its principles. It organizes whatever happens to be activated in the store. And I'll come back to the notion of activation, which is very important later. Okay, so this store, which gets fuller and fuller as you go through life, it may be connected to other stores, and very often is, by one or more interfaces. These are simply connecting pathways, if you like. So here's a lot of other systems. I haven't named them, but they are all stores, right? And in this case, the conceptual system, which is a system that processes and manages and stores meanings, this is connected by interfaces with all sorts of other systems. It's highly interconnected, very important in humans. And there I put in a sort of a representation that's a circle. It could be a complex one or a simple one, but there it is. You've got a little representation there. Now I've got the olfactory system, for example. That's a system for smell. So if you have smell sensations, you're able to make representations of them, and these will be activated each time you encounter the smell again. And here's a third one. I won't get too many, I'll just keep to three. Here's a visual system with its visual processor, and there's a visual store which will process anything that according to your visual experience, and store your representations. If you think of them as memories, that's fine. But they will be stored there, and they will be activated anytime you see the same thing, or anytime you think about it and it's not there. So it can be activated there. So let's get down to something rather simple, namely an apple. I know in Turkey, for example, you like apple tea. It's very nice. I've often had it, so I thought I'd choose apples. It's probably equally pleasant in Greece. But anyway, here we have apples, right? Your experience of apples from the very beginning of life. You will certainly have or acquire an olfactory, a smell representation of an apple, right? This will be there. So next time you see an apple, this will be activated. Next time you smell it, it'll be activated. By the same token, you develop a visual representation enabling you to identify, recognize apples in future, and you'll eventually have some sort of meaning attached to the notion of an apple, right? These are separate things. They are constructed in different ways according to different principles, but they all are the response to your experience of apples. Now, the important thing about association, right? So these interfaces can link up all these apple-related representations and associate them. They can all be associate them. So very quickly, a sort of network of not systems, but representations are formed, right? And association leads immediately to the coactivation. So once associated, one representation in one store will coactivate the others always, right? So there they are being activated. And if you're interested in bilingual research, you may be aware that current contemporary thinking now is pretty sure that once you have another language apart from your own language, whenever you use any of these two languages, they will all be activated. So those of you who have Turkish as a native language, you might think Turkish is highly irrelevant to this particular situation, but unfortunately your mind doesn't believe you. It will activate it. So it will be activated in the background. And same for Greek, same for any other language, you know. So coactivation is an important thing. Once things are associated, they are coactivated. Let's take an example. Let's take a language example. Let's take a grammatical example. This is leap. This is the word leap, and it's in a sentence. I saw her leap, and you can, knowing English, you will realize that this is a verb. So we'll ignore the fact it can also be a noun, right? So leap will have a meaning in your mind and mine. It'll have something to do with jumping, obviously. And the concept of leap will be sitting there in your memory store, and it will be associated with the sound of leap. So when you hear English leap, the meaning will pop up. Now here's a problem. Here's a problem, because in very many introductions to linguistics, for example, we are all told that what is language? Language is defined as a relationship with meaning, between meaning and sound, right? This is a kind of the simplest possible definition of language. It's an association between meanings and sounds. Well, it's not true, unfortunately, because what we have there is certainly a meaning here associated with a sound, but we have no language involved. And I'll get to that in a minute. But essentially, this is the sound of the word. The sound of the word is processed and stored in no different a way than, say, a sound of a creaking door or a glass or someone swallowing. So it has no relationship to language as such. So this is not enough. It's possible, you know, when you know a very little bit of language, to know individual sounds and associate them with meanings, but have no grammar. Okay, I think you probably all agree with that. So let's make it into a word. And to do this, we have to give it linguistic structure. And in the modular cognition framework, as we've implemented it, this means involving two different systems: a syntactic system, which contains syntactic representations, and the phonological system, which has phonological representations. These are not sounds, of course, as you know. These are just abstract structures. Some people in sort of classic generative grammar would like to merge these into one. Doesn't really matter. Modular cognition framework can cope with anything that is basically compatible with it. So it's up to you which you choose. We choose this. And this then can be linked with the sound. So what we have now is linguistic structure, and we have a real word. So that sound of leap is no longer just a sound. It's something that you can use in a sentence in all sorts of different ways. And it's a word that can be heard because it has a physical sound representation associated with it. So when you hear it, all these things will be coactivated. And now to add something else, a motor representation. This is another cognitive system, if you like. It's a sort of programming for movement, physical movement. And in this case, of course, it's the vocal tract and all the things to do with the production of language. So now you have something that you can hear and you can speak. So you have a fully fledged word. And notice that the word, which we often think of as some kind of unit, we can have lists of words, lists of vocabulary words, we can look them up in a dictionary, we can ask questions like, if you know Greek and Turkish and English, do you have 3 lexicons or are they all one? Oh, well, that's actually a completely unnecessary question in this setup, because, as you'll see in a minute, because they can all be dealt with in these two systems, right? So essentially, well, the answer would be 1, right? Okay, so these, if you like, is a collaborative network, right? Although we have different systems specializing in different things, they're linked up and they collaborate. So the whole mind works together using representations from different parts of it, which are associated and activating it to cope with myriads and myriads of tasks that we face every day, almost every millisecond. Okay, now turning to emotion and appraisal, right, which are part of the same system, namely the affective system. Here's the affective system with its processor and its store with affective structures. By the way, we often use the word structures for representations. Two basic ones are positive and negative value. These are to do with appraisal, right? So from the very beginning, you want to know what you should be attracted to and what you should avoid at all costs. And even babies are born with certain things so that they have a disgust reaction or an attraction. And so these things are probably the most basic affective structures we have. But of course, emotions are also involved, but basically only the simplest emotions, the so-called basic emotions, are in the affective system. But each of these emotions, like disgust or joy or whatever, controversy rings as to how many there are, whatever. But they're the very basic emotions, which I think we can recognize that we share with at least our nearest primates, if not with a whole lot of other animals. And these basic emotions will all of them be complex representations, and they will all contain either a positive or a negative value. So there is the affective system. Now, of course, human beings are very sophisticated in this matter. They have very complex emotions like nostalgia, or shame or envy. And these ones, it's usually understood in contemporary thinking, have to involve more than just the affective system. They need associations with concepts to make them somehow more sophisticated. So nostalgia will be some kind of basic emotion, but it will have an overlay of of meanings which are activated together with it. Okay, so we have these two values, negative and positive. So if you're a foreign language learner, you may regard the idea of foreign languages or foreign language learning as a very positive thing, right? So this will simply mean you have a strong positive value associated with the concept. And by virtue of having a very negative attitude to foreign language learning, you don't like it at all, you don't want to do it, it's very unpleasant for some reason or another, you have attached in your mind a strong negative value. It doesn't mean to say it can't be changed, but in this particular situation, the learner, the individual in question has a strong negative value. Okay, we'll come back to that in a minute. But where does grammar fit in? Grammar, okay. So I'm going to talk about two kinds of grammar. This will certainly trigger some ideas in your head already. I'll just call them grammar 1 and grammar 2. It doesn't matter really. I'll call them grammar 1 and grammar 2. So grammar 1 is only to do with linguistic structure, right? It's either this single system or, as we think, there's two systems, two types of linguistic structures. The only job they have is dealing with abstract linguistic structures. That enables us to talk to go beyond, if you like, the kind of languages that we sort of language that we see clever bonobos producing, types of chimpanzee who have a large vocabulary linking sounds of meanings, but they don't have linguistic structure, so they can't go any further, but they can impress us with heaps and heaps of sign language representation. It's not real sign language, but it's a sort of link between sound and meaning that we saw earlier. In this case, grammar 1 is something unique to humans, right? And what can I say about grammar 1? Well, everyone has one. All of you have one, I have one. You would be a very odd human being if you didn't have grammar 1. And what it does is processing linguistic structure. And by itself has no meaning. There's no meaning to a verb, has no meaning to a phonological structure. It has absolutely no meaning. It's just linguistic structure. And it handles all languages. So any language, Greek, English, Turkish, they're all handled with this. Of course, different networks of association created using this, but you don't have to have a grammar 1A, 1B, 1C for 3 languages. You just have the single grammar which copes with all language acquisition of any kind. Now, it's permanently subconscious. Again, we'll get back to that in a minute, but it's something you have no concept of the languages of the prepositions popping up in your head. You can't think, oh, this verb is particularly painful. It's simply subconscious, and it always will be. Now, grammar 2, by contrast, it's extremely difficult. Different. Can be difficult, can be easy, sorry. Grammar 2 is built up basically in the conceptual system. So first and foremost, it consists of meanings. These meanings are connected with various things, of course, but basically it's a conceptual phenomenon, right? So not everyone has a grammar 2. And if they have something, they don't have much of it, right? They may be taught a little at school, but quickly forget it in their adult. If you're a linguist, language teacher, applied linguist, you will have a lot of grammar 2 in your head, and it'll all be stored based in this system. And it's built out of meanings, conceptual structures, conceptual representations. It may be used to describe any language, much of it is available for conscious reflection. It's very much associated with thought and thinking and reflection. And finally, it may be acquired. It is acquired from school age onwards, provided the school education system allows you. So you will learn about your language, about a little grammar perhaps even, but certainly about a lot of language, and you will develop this in your conceptual system from school age onwards. But before that, I'm sorry, you don't have any chance at all, because second, third, fourth year children don't have the intellectual maturity to acquire this grammar 2. So it's definitely not related to first language acquisition of the grammar. So comparing the two, grammar is built from linguistic structures. That's grammar 1. It's sometimes called implicit grammar, intuitive grammar, subconscious grammar, goes by other names. You'll be familiar with them. And grammar 2, you'll also be familiar with, that's built from conceptual structure. It's regarded as conscious grammar, explicit grammar, meta grammar, knowledge about grammar rather than of grammar. And if you like to deal with it in a modular composition framework perspective, you could even call it conceptual grammar to distinguish it from the linguistic grammar. So there is the grammar 1. And notice that grammar is not the same as language. We're very careful to distinguish the two. Grammar is a much more limited concept. Language involves the whole mind. And even in the sort of discussions I've been having so far, we've had examples of this. So language is definitely a mind-wide phenomenon, whereas linguistic grammar, grammar 1, is very limited. Okay, now hopping back into history to the affective filter hypothesis, let's see if we can somehow reformulate this rather vaguely formulated but interesting hypothesis in more precise terms in the light of contemporary thinking. So here it is, just to remind you, Krashen and his colleagues, Dulé and Burt, said that comprehensible input will not result in language acquisition. That's to say, to acquire language, you need to be exposed to the language together with something to help you understand the meanings, so you can make those associations. But it will not result in language acquisition if the input is filtered before it can reach the language processing faculties. That's what he called it. The before is important here. And I would call this sort of an input starvation hypothesis, right? So, and this filtering he adds, or they add, because I'm quoting from Language 2, 1982, by Burt, Dulé and Krashen. This filtering may occur because of anxiety, poor self-esteem, and low motivation, right? So immediately we think affect. Okay, so there's a grammar builder of some kind. They don't go into that. It's like a black box in those days. Here's the affective filter, right? Which is not quite sure what it is, but it has something to do with anxiety and emotion. And here is the input coming in from outside, input here regarded as the language that you are exposed to from the environment. And suddenly, because of this affective filter, it gets suddenly reduced. So essentially, the grammar builder is getting fed with much less input. So it has difficulty acquiring new associations and constructing new representations because it has very much less to deal with. So in other words, any development will inevitably proceed much more slowly. Now, the implication for grammar 1 is that if this reduced, from the point of view of the modular cognition framework, if this reduced ability to acquire grammar is due solely to the downgrading of the input, that's to say, less input is coming in, it's being prevented from coming in. For example, conceptual input, giving you the meaning as you're listening to the language, the meaning is being reduced, for example, and the positive evidence that is contained in the language, the little structures that you should be noticing in order to acquire, the grammar. This seems to imply fairly clearly to me, in fact, that what they call the grammar processing mechanisms, in other words, I would call it grammar 1, in other words, the phonological and syntactic systems, the implication is that they are possibly immune from affect. So it's not the case that your anxiety is affecting your grammar, it's affecting what's coming into your grammar. That's the whole idea. So they're not influenced by negative affectives. Therefore, we have to say that this so-called impoverishment or reduction of the input could either mean two things. Either the learner is getting less frequent exposure, they're not getting as much exposure as they should, or they will getting input that is just as frequent, but is somehow made weaker by this so-called affective principle, affective filter. So this opposes the question, what exactly does weaker mean, right? We know what grammar builder means. We know what the black box means now a little more because we have the framework that allows us to formulate it in a particular way. But what does weaker mean? So how can we use this framework to reformulate the idea of weakness and strength, right? And then we'll see how affect works. Well, now, so what I'm really saying in modular cognition terms is that this affective system may have interfaces with all kinds of things, but it doesn't have a direct interface with phonological and syntactic structures. So it doesn't immediately make you, have an impact, not immediately, at least not directly. And in fact, in the current system, we have these linguistic structures are rather poorly interconnected. They have a connection with the auditory structure for sound, obviously. They need a connection with the visual representations for sign language and possibly also for writing. And they need a connection with the conceptual system, but that's it. They only have 1, 2, 3 outside connections. But as I've already indicated, the conceptual system and the affective system are multiply interconnected across the mind and are very different. And affect is capable of being associated with an awful lot of different representations. Well, there might be an evolutionary advantage if you think about it, since grammar 1 begins by serving the vital function of enabling first language, mother tongues, to be acquired for the 2-year-old child, right? Assuming there's adequate exposure to the language, which there usually is, this pretty much guarantees full acquisition of the system, at least the grammar system, under quite adverse circumstances, either cognitive ones or emotional systems. So it's pretty robust, grammar 1. So that's what suggests that it is not immediately affected by anxiety or that kind of thing, as it seems to be with second language learners. So grammar 1 can proceed efficiently and subconsciously without distraction And also, importantly, it requires very low levels of activation to work. How will this work later on with L2, L3 for other languages? Well, as always in the MCF, a big part of the explanation has to do with activation levels. Normally, the more frequently a particular representation is activated in its store, the more its current resting level of activation increases, making it more competitive, making it stronger, if you like. Here's a quick note of that. So here we've got a leap. Let's call this the sound of leap, the auditory representation of leap. Remember, we saw that earlier. And let's take May, June, and May, right? So you're being continually sort of exposed to the sound of leap. What happens is that its resting level is there. In June, somehow, mysteriously, it's up, right? And in July, it's even higher. And the higher it is, the quicker it can get into competition and activation with all the other things that are activated. So when it's activated, that's the point, whether it's in May, June, or July, when it's activated, what actually happens, we think, is the ultimate result is when it's no longer used and it becomes deactivated, it falls down, but not to the original resting levels. So each time it's activated, it will rise up just a little bit. So it will begin from a more advantageous position. That's the sort of metaphor we use. But of course, in each particular store, it's different. It has to be activated as input to a store, not from the environment. So a representation can get an extra boost now if an association with positive value is present. So over and above what I've just said, if you have an association with positive affect, it has the effect of boosting the activation even further, right? So if it's activated, then this will be activated more strongly than it would normally be. So what this means then, potentially more attention is made to the meaning of leap as you're experiencing it, and more attention is being paid to the sound of leap. These, as it were, are being enhanced. And the effect of this is you get better quality input, both to the syntax and to both to the syntax and to the conceptual structure. Now, what this means in effect is that the input from auditory structure is knocking at the door, as it were, of phonology and saying, here I am. It doesn't necessarily say phonology will react because it may not be ready for this particular structure. But it will have the better chance if it's enhanced in this way. In the same way with the conceptual structure, the meaning structure will be knocking at the door of syntax and saying, let me in, I want you to react. Syntax may not be quite ready for this particular thing, but it might well react as well. So it gives everything a better chance. It raises the quality of the input to the different structures. Now, I said that the affect is not connected to the grammar one, but in fact, there is an indirect connection because the effect of affect boosting one representation, it will spread, the activation will spread right around the system. And it will also give a slight activation boost to these systems as well. So once they are, once you have a connection, these will now be activated to some extent. But since the grammar one only needs a rather low level of activation to work efficiently, the relative activation increase will not certainly get anywhere near it being made conscious. Right, so there's a bit of a dilemma here, because what about negative value? What about negative value? Now, logically, it might seem that a highly active negative value, just like a positive value, would also boost the activation levels of the associated representations, right? A very negative will also have a strong boosting and activation effect, and surely it will have the same positive results. Well, I mean, the simple answer is, well, I'm going to a lot of detail, is that negative values happen always to trigger a fight or flight reaction. So this is a thing I didn't tell you about, but you will probably accept it, right? So if something has a strong negative value, what it tends to react, it triggers something to resist it in some way, right? So, for example, learners will avoid exposure to the L2 where possible. And if it's imposed, if they're in a classroom and they're made to listen, right, so the sounds are coming in, they will create different kinds of distractions to limit the exposure. And they won't necessarily do this, obviously, consciously, but this will be the result. So my conclusion is that the effective filter hypothesis can be reformulated much more precisely in processing terms in ways that reflect current thinking, and not just within language teaching circles, and not just within applied linguistics, and not just within SLA and multilingualism research, but within cognitive science in general. So we see how it works, you know, in the mind as a whole, as part of so we were just talking about grammar, but it would apply across the board, right? So more precise formulation leads to more precise research questions, and investigating more precise research questions leads to better understanding, and better understanding leads to more effective applications, as in the case of second language teaching. And that brings me to the end.
Thank you so much, Mike. Thank you so much. Very enlightening as always. Thank you. Thank you so much. Maybe we can have a couple of questions from our participants. If you have questions, you can just.
Please ask me, because I went through it quite quickly, and there are a lot of things that you might need clarification about. So please feel free. Wow. My question to you would be, does that somehow reflect your own experience of language learning? And if you're a language teacher,
Yes, Michael. Yes, Michael, please.
All right. Yeah, let me just show myself. Give me a moment.
Oh, hi.
All right. Yeah. Thanks so much for that. Really inspirational. I was wondering, when you showed the example with LEAP and how higher incidence of hearing that word were activated more, was wondering whether there may not be, in the case of second language acquisition or first language acquisition, a ceiling effect where you've already heard that word a couple of times and you figured out what it means, so it no longer makes a difference. And whether, more generally speaking, we always need the affective component for acquisition, and whether there are some scenarios where we require attention and noticing, but where it may be a bit less dependent on emotional activation.
Yeah, that's a very nice question. Certainly in the process of learning, you will eventually get this up in principle to the level where you have easy access to it, right? So you won't need any effort or any emotional boost in order for it to just pop up naturally, because it will have such a high resting level, it'll pop up very quickly to the top when it's needed. And provided you get continual exposure to English and to this particular word from time to time, it will more or less stay in that position. However, imagine a situation where you stop being exposed to English altogether, you move to another country, you don't listen to English, then the effect is that the resting levels will start to sink down because they won't get this continual boost, right? So we'll be back at stage one. So that's one thing. So indeed, effective boosting will have no longer any use once you've got easy access to it. Now you asked me something else connected with that. I can't. Can you remind me what that?
Yeah, well, it was indeed connected. So regarding the role of attention and noticing beyond this sort of ceiling effect, but where you might not necessarily require an affective component.
Yes, so what I'm saying is that the ceiling effect is really when it gets to a level, a resting level, which is sufficient for it to perform happily for you whenever you need it, right? So that would be your ceiling effect. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you. Margaret, yes, can we have your question?
Here, yes, I'm concerned about the situation of language attrition and language loss, and how far down below at the beginning can it be brought back up if a proper input is put in, or is it simply it's lost and you can't get it back up? I've been concerned about an issue of someone who has been isolated and solitary and is no longer exposed to English, but is just sits there. And is it worth trying to have special classes that would boost that again? We're talking about someone in solitary confinement.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I do have an answer. So,
good.
Yes. Now, obviously, once the activation level has fallen so low as to be perhaps even lower than it would have been when you acquired the representation for the very first time, but couldn't really use it very much.
Mm-hmm.
Once it's the question is, does it ever slip off out of the store altogether? And of course, we can't really answer that.
Yeah.
Neuroscience will give us an answer to that. But effectively, it's beyond your reach. Yeah, that's what you're saying. Is it worth? I think absolutely it is. Absolutely. And there's a very, I once read a paper on, who was it? I doesn't, a paper on Australian women who were originally immigrants, right? They had immigrated from another country, and they had completely lost, they would say they completely lost their first language, quite unable to use it. If it was spoken to them, I mean, it's the worst possible kind of loss that you might imagine, total attrition, right? But when they came to their 80s, it started coming back.
Interesting.
Yeah, so it's so this language that was appeared to be lost completely for a long period of time, started to reappear again mysteriously. Of course, they were as surprised as anyone. Where was it coming from? And I guess that part of the benign effects of aging is that you lose whatever it is that's suppressing things of not relevant, become less, and this happens across the board, you can speak more frankly if you've been polite and forth. So I have a feeling it has something to do with inhibition, and it will be very interesting to research that further. So I'm positive about that.
But that would also apply to the possibility of attrition in the second language.
Yes,
absolutely.
Absolutely.
So it's not a total loss if, it's not a total write the person off and don't bother giving him any language classes because he's lost it.
No, absolutely not.
Okay.
Not. So it's a question of access rather than.
That's what I felt like it, but I needed to have,
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you so much. Yes, Vijaya. Vijaya, you have a question from India? Well, her question is, in fact, she typed the question. Maybe she wants to ask. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I was wondering if grammar 1 and grammar 2 are in some way, they complement the idea of syntactic bootstrapping, and what's the kind of relation, and how do I understand these three concepts?
Yeah, okay, so translating semantic bootstrapping into the terminology of the modular cognition framework simply means conceptual bootstrapping, right? So are you talking about first language acquisition, right?
Yes.
You talked about first language acquisition. Yeah, so yeah, you can develop, I mean, this is a situation where researchers who are interested in semantic bootstrapping or any kind of bootstrapping can use this framework to formulate questions about it, just like the one you just so I can't, I mean, the framework doesn't have an answer to that, but clearly what needs to be done is something has to be associated across the interface between a meaning in the conceptual representation and the syntactic system, right? So the general idea is that in the beginning, you have either no connections with linguistic structure, or you have rather weak ones, right? But you have very strong meaning connections. So you can work with, well, in the case of a second language learner, of course, you already have activated basic linguistic structures. They're there being activated and they can be connected. But there are some approaches which think that second language learners, for example, in an immigrant situation, begin with a more or less semantic based system, right? Where things are, you simply put things at the beginning of a so-called sentence because they're more important, or at the end of a sentence because they're more important, not because they're nouns or verbs, right? That's, you could somehow, because we have an enormously sophisticated conceptual system, we can manipulate things just with meanings and sounds. So we can do much more than the bonobo. You know, the poor bonobo is actually an amazing acquirer, as it turns out, between linking sounds, or in this case, sorry, sound symbols with meanings, and it can communicate quite a lot, allegedly in simple sentences, but they're not really sentences. They are simply, two things put together by association. But it does look a bit like a sort of primitive pigeon. So by extension, human beings with a more sophisticated conceptual system are able to manipulate much more. You can sort of fake a bit of language. You can start speaking with individual sounds and organize them in a way which are not, let's say, dictated by your grammar 1, which is not yet sufficiently activated or very weakly activated. And at a certain point, of course, the connections between the conceptual system, the meanings, and the linguistic structures will become strong enough for you to start to develop a proper linguistic system for this particular language. That's how I would assess. That's what I would say. But as I say, you have to test out various approaches to semantic bootstrapping according to the literature, and see if they can be plausibly fitted into the new modular cognition framework. Modular cognition framework says this is the way we think the mind works. So you may have a fantastically clever theory about how languages are learned in the very beginning, but if it turns out by applying the modular cognition framework to be simply implausible, then you probably be advised to try another one, which is more plausible. As I say, the modular cognition framework can accommodate different hypotheses, so it's not the case that it imposes some single one. But that's a nice question. I like it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vijaya. Thank you so much. Thank you. Yes, Zubeyde. Can we get a question?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry, my camera doesn't work, so just that's why I
It's
cannot
okay.
turn it on. So let me just introduce myself. I'm a professor of TESOL and Applied Linguistics at Honorary University in Turkey, and teaching SLA for many, many years. And I had my PhD in the United States, and also had the opportunity to teach SLA when Usha Lakshmanan was on sabbatical for 1 year. So I have been involved in SLA for so many years now, teaching. Yeah, I'm in the course again at master's level and doctoral level at our university. Thank you very much again, Jen, for organizing this wonderful speech
Thank
for
you.
us. We enjoyed among so many webinars. You know, it was really hard to choose, but when I saw the name, of course, I decided to join the webinar. Thank you very much.
Many thanks for joining us.
Thank you. I have two questions, maybe related or maybe not related so much. One question is, as we all know, there is since mid-1990s, we see this ongoing social turn in SLA. You know, the social perspective gain importance, and which has its roots in social constructivism and socioculturalism, and post-structuralism, of course. And how do you make a connection, or would you make a connection between your let's say theory here that you explained, which is mostly presents a cognitive perspective on SLA, and whether you would like to make a connection between these social perspective on SLA. And another question is related to whether you are planning to reformulate other hypotheses proposed by Krashen. We cannot just get away from Krashen. For so many years, we have been talking about him and his hypotheses. And when you kind of, let's say, freshen up this effective filter hypotheses of Krashen, whether how you are looking at the distinction between learning and acquisition. Do you make a distinction between these two processes, which is, as you know, always, which is now, nowadays, we know that it's been a little bit outdated.
Well,
how do you look at that distinction when you try to reformulate the effective filter hypothesis?
Okay. So I'll deal with the questions in reverse, right? So
sure, no problem.
Last question is, okay, learning and acquisition, all very awkward terms, weren't they? Actually, they can easily be reformulated, because learning is a conceptual, is building more and more representations of language in the conceptual system. That's what learning is, right? Now, this says nothing about if it can help, the course of second language learning. There's no implication there. That's an open question. But when you build up, when learning then is actually acquiring more and more sophisticated representations of the language that you're happening to be acquiring via the linguistic systems that I mentioned, the two ones in my case. So you might say one is conceptual learning and the other one is linguistic learning. And they are separate processes, and it's an open question as to how one can activate the other. Some people claim that a little bit of conceptual grammar, a little bit of explicit grammar can somehow enhance attention, but that's a whole different, that's an extra thing. So there's no problem about that. Taking your social, yes, as you're right, this is a cognitive perspective, but it's absolutely connectable with a social sociolinguistics. And the thing is that, remember I said that language is a mind-wide phenomenon. So when you are acquiring or using a language, all your brain and all your mind is activated, including all the things which have to do with which sociolinguists are interested in, right? So all of these will have an impact and can be translated into aspects of, let's say, the conceptual system and the associations. And also, indeed, of course, when we're talking about affect, if a language has a low prestige, you know, if you're learning a language or you happen to know a language with very low prestige, it means it will be associated a great deal with negative affect. So you will tend to avoid using it, like in heritage language speakers. Sometimes children grow up and they get a negative association with the language of the family. So when they go out and talk with their friends, they avoid it, and they tend to avoid the language altogether. So all of these things have sociolinguistic ramifications. And ultimately, all these sociolinguistic constructions have no value unless they are sometimes represented in the human mind, because the outside environment, remember, which sociolinguists are interested in, and with good reason, the outside environment is just a question of physical sensations impacting on your ears and your eyes, your nose, and your mouth. That's all it is. It's raw input, and this has to be recreated in your head. So you have, as it were, an internal world which you build up on the basis of all the input you're getting from outside. And this is the internal world, the internal context in which you speak language. So I think that kind of makes the link between what sociolinguists are interested and their various approaches to it, and the cognitive one. So we mustn't regard them as absolutely, you know, black and white and separate. They're eminently associatable.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think we need to stop now because it's already an hour. Mike, it's an honor. Thank you so much. It's great to see you again. And thank you so much for your invaluable participation in this webinar. And Zoe, thank you so much. It's great to see you again. Hope to see you soon. And dear participants, dear colleagues, we really thank you very much for your participation and invaluable contributions and wonderful questions. And I would like to wish you have a good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are, and hope to see you in another webinar. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
They're all being deactivated.
Activated. Okay.
I mean, I can stay around for a bit if you're interested, but I'm free.
Hi, Dana. How are you doing? Oh, Dana is here from Poland. We cannot hear you. Your mic is muted.
Ah, I see. Dana.
Oh yeah, okay.
Yes, Dana.
Hi, Cham.
Yes.
It's great to see you.
Hi,
Great to
Dana.
see
How are
Mike.
you doing? Great to see you too.
Great to see you. Well, you know, Sturk went quite well. Sturk on Zoom, so it was quite a challenge. But we even had a sort of evening drink on Friday to keep the spirits high.
Great to hear that.
So with
great
music.
To hear that.
So it went well. It went well. Yeah. Okay,
Amazing,
great.
amazing. Hope to be there next year.
Yeah, we'll be sending information in October.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Okay.
Good to see you. Good to see you.
You too. Welcome to Strik next year.
Oh, yeah.
Hopefully, yeah. Hopefully.
Yes.
Yes, I missed that one.
You'll get the information. So,
All right. Okay,
so
thank you so much.
thank you.
I guess we're going to end the seminar. Okay, thank you, Mike. Thank you, Zoe.
Thank you.
Bye, Dana.
Thank
Bye.
Thank you, Mike.
Bye-bye,
Thank you,
bye-bye,
Ted.
Sham. Bye-bye,
Bye,
Mike and
everyone.
everyone. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.